George Strait reveals his favorite spot in his mansion and impresses America with his secrets. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the endless Texas sky as 17-year-old Miguel Sanchez guided his weathered pickup truck through the dusty roads leading to Riverside Ranch. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel with the same gentle firmness he used when handling the horses that had become his second family. In the passenger seat lay his most precious possession, a guitar that had seen better days, its wood scarred by years of use, but still capable of producing the sweetest melodies that seemed to flow from Miguel's soul like water from a spring. Miguel had been working at Riverside Ranch for 3 years now, ever since his father Carlos had been laid off from the construction company, and the family's financial situation had become desperate. What started as a weekend job to help pay for groceries had transformed into a full-time commitment that consumed his days, but never his dreams. Every morning at 5:30, Miguel would arrive at the ranch, greeting each horse by name as if they were old friends sharing secrets in the pre-dawn darkness. The ranch belonged to Martha Henderson, a widow in her 70s who had inherited the property from her late husband. Martha had a reputation for being tough but fair, and she had taken a special liking to Miguel from the very first day he showed up asking for work. She noticed how he sang softly to the horses as he brushed their coats, how his voice seemed to calm even the most restless stallions, and how his presence brought a sense of peace to the entire stable. "Miguel, you have a gift," Martha would often tell him as she watched him work. "That voice of yours could take you places beyond these ranch gates." But Miguel would simply smile and continue with his chores, knowing that dreams were luxuries his family could not afford. His parents, Rosa and Carlos Sanchez, had immigrated from Mexico 15 years ago with nothing but hope and determination. They had built a modest life in the small town of Cedar Creek, Texas, where Carlos worked various jobs and Rosa cleaned houses for wealthy families in the neighboring city. As Miguel parked his truck near the main stable, he could hear the familiar sounds that had become the soundtrack of his life: horses neighing in the distance, the gentle rustling of hay, and the rhythmic sound of hooves against the wooden floors. He grabbed his guitar and made his way to the tack room, where he always stored it during work hours. This guitar had been his grandfather's, passed down through generations of Sanchez men who had found solace in music during the hardest times of their lives. Before heading out to tend to the horses, Miguel allowed himself a moment of indulgence. He sat on a hay bale in the corner of the stable and strummed a few chords, feeling the familiar vibration of the strings against his fingertips. Without even realizing it, he began to sing a song he had been working on for weeks, a melody that seemed to capture the essence of his daily struggles and dreams. "There's a young man working sunrise to sunset, dreams dancing in his heart like fire. Every note he plays tells a story of hope that will never tire." His voice echoed through the stable, rich and pure, carrying emotions that words alone could never express. The horses seemed to respond to his music, their ears perking up as if they understood every word he sang. Miguel's talent had not gone unnoticed in the small community of Cedar Creek. He had performed at local church events and community gatherings, always receiving enthusiastic applause and encouraging words from neighbors who recognized his exceptional ability. But performing at small-town events was a far cry from the stages he dreamed of gracing, the recording studios he imagined himself in, and the audiences he hoped to move with his music. What many people in town knew, but Miguel tried to keep to himself, was that he spent every spare moment writing songs. His small bedroom at home was filled with notebooks containing lyrics that told stories of immigrant families, of working-class struggles, of young people chasing impossible dreams, and of the kind of love that transcends boundaries and prejudices. These were songs that came from the deepest parts of his soul, inspired by his own experiences and those of his community. Dear friends, if you're enjoying Miguel's inspiring journey, we'd love to have you subscribe to our channel and become part of our amazing community. Please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from around the world. Your support means everything to us as we continue bringing you these heartfelt stories that touch the soul. The ranch work was demanding, but Miguel approached each task with dedication and pride. He cleaned stalls with meticulous care, ensuring that each horse had fresh bedding and clean water. He groomed the animals with gentle strokes, checking for any signs of injury or illness. He repaired fences, organized feed supplies, and helped Martha with administrative tasks that kept the ranch running smoothly. Despite the physical demands of the work, Miguel never complained, understanding that this job was not just his responsibility, but his family's lifeline. During his lunch breaks, Miguel would often sit under the large oak tree near the main house, eating the simple sandwiches his mother packed for him while quietly strumming his guitar. It was during one of these peaceful moments that Martha Henderson approached him with an expression of excitement and determination that Miguel had never seen before. "Miguel, I've been thinking about something for weeks," Martha said, settling down on a wooden bench nearby. "There's a music festival coming up next month in Austin. It's called the Lone Star Country Music Festival, and they're holding open auditions for new talent. I think you should audition." Miguel's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the festival. He had heard about the Lone Star Country Music Festival. It was one of the most prestigious events in Texas, attracting talent scouts, record label representatives, and some of the biggest names in country music. The very thought of performing on such a stage seemed both thrilling and terrifying. "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your faith in me, but—" Miguel began, his voice trailing off as he considered the practical obstacles that stood in his way. "But nothing," Martha interrupted firmly. "Miguel, I've been around music my whole life. My late husband used to play guitar, and I've heard plenty of singers come and go. What you have is special, son. It's not just technical skill, though you certainly have that. It's something deeper. You have the ability to make people feel something real when you sing." Martha reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled newspaper clipping. "Look here. The auditions are open to anyone. The registration fee is $50, and the winner gets a chance to perform on the main stage alongside some of the biggest stars in country music. Miguel, this could be your chance to show the world what you can do." As Miguel held the newspaper clipping in his trembling hands, he felt a mixture of hope and fear coursing through his veins. $50 might not seem like much to most people, but for the Sanchez family, it represented a significant expense. That money could buy groceries for a week, or help with the electricity bill, or contribute to the small savings account his parents maintained for emergencies. "I don't know if my family can afford the registration fee," Miguel admitted quietly, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Martha studied his face for a long moment, recognizing the internal struggle playing out in his expression. "Miguel, what if I told you that I believe in your talent so much that I'm willing to sponsor your audition? Consider it an investment in your future." The generosity of Martha's offer overwhelmed Miguel, and for a moment he couldn't find words to respond. Throughout his life, he had encountered people who showed kindness to his family, but this level of support and belief in his abilities was something entirely new. He thought about his parents, who worked tirelessly to provide for their family, and about his younger sister, Maria, who looked up to him as a role model and source of inspiration. "Mrs. Henderson, I can't accept your money," Miguel finally said, his voice filled with gratitude but also determination. "But if you really believe in me, would you be willing to let me work extra hours to earn the registration fee? I could come in on weekends, stay later during the week, whatever it takes." Martha smiled, recognizing the pride and integrity that drove Miguel's response. "Son, you already work harder than any employee I've ever had, but if earning the money yourself is important to you, then we'll figure out a way to make that happen." Over the following weeks, Miguel threw himself into his work with renewed energy and purpose. He arrived at the ranch even earlier, stayed later into the evening, and took on additional responsibilities that Martha had been planning to hire someone else to handle. He cleaned and organized the storage areas, painted fences that had been weathered by years of Texas sun and rain, and even helped Martha update her record-keeping system. During this time, Miguel's music evolved as well. The songs he wrote began to reflect his growing sense of possibility and determination. He composed melodies that captured the feeling of working toward a dream, of pushing through exhaustion and doubt, of believing in yourself, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. His guitar playing became more confident, his voice stronger and more expressive, as if the very act of working toward his goal was transforming him into the artist he was meant to become. The horses at Riverside Ranch seemed to sense the change in Miguel as well. They responded to his presence with even greater affection and trust, as if they could feel the energy and excitement radiating from him as he went about his daily tasks. Shadow, a particularly spirited black stallion who had been difficult for previous ranch hands to handle, became especially attached to Miguel, following him around the stable and nuzzling his shoulder whenever Miguel paused in his work. As the registration deadline for the Lone Star Country Music Festival approached, Miguel found himself caught between anticipation and anxiety. He had saved enough money to cover the registration fee, plus a little extra for gas and food for the trip to Austin. He had practiced his audition song dozens of times, a heartfelt ballad about finding strength in your roots while reaching for your dreams. He had even convinced his parents to let him take a day off from the ranch to attend the auditions, though they remained skeptical about the wisdom of pursuing music as anything more than a hobby. The night before the auditions, Miguel sat in his small bedroom, holding his grandfather's guitar and thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought about his family's sacrifices, about Martha Henderson's unwavering support, about all the dreams he had nurtured during long days in the stable. Tomorrow would bring either the beginning of his music career or a harsh reminder that some dreams were meant to remain just that, dreams. But as Miguel strummed a few final chords and prepared for bed, he felt a sense of peace and determination settling over him like a warm blanket. Whatever happened at the auditions, he would face it with courage and dignity, knowing that he had earned his chance through hard work and dedication. The boy who had started working at Riverside Ranch 3 years ago had grown into a young man with the strength and character to pursue his dreams regardless of where they might lead him. The morning of the auditions arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes everything seem possible. Miguel had barely slept, his mind racing with melodies and lyrics, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that made him feel alive in ways he had never experienced before. He dressed carefully in his best clothes, a pressed white shirt his mother had ironed the night before, dark jeans without holes or stains, and the cowboy boots his father had given him for his 16th birthday. The drive to Austin took 3 hours, during which Miguel practiced his audition song over and over again, his voice echoing through the cab of his pickup truck as the Texas landscape rolled by outside his windows. He had chosen to perform Roots and Wings, an original composition that told the story of a young man honoring his heritage while pursuing his dreams in a new land. The song was deeply personal, drawing from his own experiences and those of his family, and he believed it represented the best of his songwriting abilities. As Miguel approached the festival grounds, he was struck by the sheer scale of the event. The Lone Star Country Music Festival sprawled across several acres with multiple stages, vendor booths selling everything from barbecue to handcrafted guitars, and thousands of people wandering around in cowboy hats and boots. The main stage was enormous, equipped with sophisticated sound and lighting systems that made Miguel's head spin as he imagined himself performing there. The audition area was set up near a smaller stage toward the back of the festival grounds. A long line of hopeful performers stretched around the perimeter, each person clutching an instrument or sheet music, their faces reflecting the same mixture of hope and anxiety that Miguel felt churning in his stomach. Some were clearly experienced performers, dressed in elaborate costumes and carrying expensive instruments, while others looked more like Miguel himself, ordinary people with extraordinary dreams. Miguel took his place at the end of the line, his grandfather's guitar case slung over his shoulder, and began to observe the other contestants. There was a woman in her 40s wearing a sequined dress who kept practicing vocal runs that echoed across the area. A teenage boy with perfectly styled hair and a guitar that probably cost more than Miguel's truck was running through complex finger-picking patterns. A group of men in matching shirts were harmonizing on what sounded like a professionally arranged song. As the line slowly moved forward, Miguel could hear snippets of the auditions taking place on the stage. Some performances received polite applause, others were cut short after just a few bars, and a few elicited enthusiastic cheers from the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered to watch the proceedings. The judges appeared to be music industry professionals, their faces serious and evaluative, as they scribbled notes on clipboards and whispered among themselves. The hours passed slowly, and Miguel found himself engaged in conversations with other contestants who shared stories of their musical journeys and dreams of making it in the country music industry. There was Sarah, a single mother from Dallas, who had been writing songs for 10 years while working as a nurse. There was Tommy, a ranch hand from El Paso, who had taught himself to play guitar watching YouTube videos. There was Elena, a college student who sang in her church choir and dreamed of recording gospel-influenced country music. What struck Miguel most about these conversations was the diversity of backgrounds and experiences represented among the contestants. Despite the stereotypes often associated with country music, the people in line with him came from all walks of life, united by their love of music and their determination to pursue their dreams regardless of the obstacles they faced. As Miguel's turn approached, he felt his nervousness intensifying. His palms were sweating, his heart was racing, and he found himself second-guessing every aspect of his performance. Should he change his song to something more traditional? Was his guitar too old and worn to make a good impression? Did he look professional enough to be taken seriously by the judges? Finally, after nearly 4 hours of waiting, Miguel heard his name called. "Miguel Sanchez, you're up next," announced a festival volunteer, a young woman with a clipboard and a headset who looked harried from managing the long line of contestants. Miguel walked onto the small stage, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him as he faced the panel of 3 judges seated at a table about 20 feet away. The middle judge, a man in his 50s wearing an expensive-looking hat and boots, looked up from his paperwork with an expression that seemed to convey both boredom and impatience. To his left sat a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a business suit that suggested she worked for a record label or management company. To his right was a younger man with a beard and casual clothes who appeared to be a songwriter or producer. "State your name and where you're from," the middle judge said in a flat, disinterested tone that immediately put Miguel on edge. "My name is Miguel Sanchez, and I'm from Cedar Creek, Texas," Miguel replied, his voice slightly hoarse from nervousness. The middle judge, whose nameplate identified him as Robert Caldwell, looked up from his notes with a smirk that Miguel found unsettling. "Sanchez, huh? That's not exactly a country music name, is it, boy?" Miguel felt a flush of embarrassment and confusion at the comment, but he tried to maintain his composure. "I'd like to perform an original song called Roots and Wings, if that's okay." "Original song," Caldwell repeated with a chuckle that sounded more mocking than amused. "Well, let's see what you've got, Miguel. But let me give you some free advice before you start. Country music is about authentic American stories, not whatever it is you people sing about." The other 2 judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly recognizing that Caldwell's comments had crossed a line, but neither spoke up to challenge him. Miguel felt his face burning with shame and anger, but he was determined not to let this man's prejudice derail his dream. He adjusted his guitar strap, took a deep breath, and began to play the opening chords of his song. Miguel's voice, despite his emotional turmoil, was clear and powerful as he began to sing. "I carry the stories my grandfather told, of mountains and valleys and hearts brave and bold. I honor the struggle that brought us this far, while reaching for dreams like a bright northern star." The melody was beautiful, the lyrics heartfelt and universal in their themes of heritage and aspiration. But Miguel had barely finished the first verse when Caldwell held up his hand in a gesture that clearly meant stop. "That's enough," the judge said with a dismissive wave. "Son, I'm going to save you some time and embarrassment here. Country music is for real Americans who understand what this country is all about. You might want to stick to mariachi music or whatever it is your people play. This just isn't for you." The words hit Miguel like physical blows, each syllable designed to humiliate and dismiss not just his performance but his very right to participate in the musical tradition he loved so deeply. The small crowd of onlookers had fallen silent, some looking shocked at Caldwell's blatant prejudice, others nodding in agreement with his sentiments. "But I am American," Miguel said quietly, his voice barely audible as he struggled to process what was happening. "I was born in Texas. This is my home." Caldwell laughed loudly, a sound that carried across the audition area and drew even more attention to the unfolding scene. "Born here or not, you don't belong on a country music stage, kid. Why don't you go back to cleaning stables or whatever it is you do for work? Leave the music to people who actually understand what country means." The reference to cleaning stables felt like a final insult, suggesting that Caldwell saw Miguel as nothing more than hired help, unworthy of artistic aspirations or creative dreams. Miguel felt tears threatening to spill from his eyes, but he refused to give this man the satisfaction of seeing him cry. Instead, he carefully placed his guitar back in its case, his hands shaking with a combination of rage and humiliation. As Miguel began to walk off the stage, he could hear murmurs from the crowd, some expressing sympathy for what they had witnessed, others laughing at what they apparently saw as an amusing spectacle. The weight of his shattered dream felt almost unbearable as he made his way through the festival grounds, past the food vendors and merchandise booths, past the families enjoying a day of music and entertainment, past everything that had seemed so full of possibility just hours earlier. Miguel found himself behind one of the equipment trailers, away from the crowds and noise of the festival, where he finally allowed himself to break down. The tears came in waves, carrying with them not just the disappointment of his failed audition, but years of accumulated frustration and struggle. He thought about Martha Henderson's faith in him, about his parents' sacrifices, about all the dreams he had built up around this moment, only to have them crushed by one man's prejudice and cruelty. What Miguel didn't know was that the entire exchange had been witnessed by someone whose presence at the festival had been kept secret from the general public. George Strait, the undisputed king of country music, had been invited to serve as a surprise guest judge for the final round of auditions. He had arrived early and was observing the preliminary rounds from a position behind the judges' table, taking notes on promising performers and getting a feel for the level of talent being showcased. George had been watching Miguel's audition from the beginning, immediately recognizing the young man's natural ability and the authentic emotion in his voice. He had been preparing to suggest that Miguel be advanced to the next round when Caldwell's ugly display of prejudice erupted. The legendary singer had watched in growing anger as one of the most talented performers of the day was humiliated and dismissed based solely on his ethnic background. As Miguel disappeared from view, George Strait made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He stood up from his concealed position, straightened his hat, and walked toward the judges' table with the kind of determined stride that suggested something significant was about to happen. The festival organizers who recognized him began to whisper excitedly among themselves, but George's attention was focused entirely on Robert Caldwell, who was still chuckling about his treatment of Miguel. What happened next would become the stuff of country music legend, a moment that would be talked about for years to come and would forever change how the industry thought about inclusion, respect, and the true meaning of American music. But first, George Strait had to find a young man named Miguel Sanchez and convince him that his dream was far from over. George Strait moved through the festival grounds with the quiet determination that had characterized his entire career. Despite being one of the most recognizable figures in country music, he had perfected the art of moving through crowds without drawing attention to himself. Wearing a simple black hat pulled low over his eyes and a worn denim jacket, he looked like any other festival attendee as he searched for the young man who had been so cruelly dismissed. Behind the equipment trailers, George found Miguel sitting on the ground, with his back against a large speaker case, his guitar beside him and his head buried in his hands. The sight of this talented young man's despair stirred something deep within George's heart. Memories of his own early struggles and the mentors who had believed in him when others had turned away. "Son," George said quietly, approaching slowly so as not to startle Miguel. "Mind if I sit with you for a minute?" Miguel looked up, his eyes red from crying, and for a moment didn't recognize the man standing before him. When realization dawned, his expression shifted to one of complete shock. George Strait, the man whose music had inspired Miguel's love of country songs, whose career represented everything Miguel dreamed of achieving, was standing there asking to sit with him. "Mr. Strait?" Miguel stammered, quickly wiping his eyes and starting to stand. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I should get out of your way." "Stay right where you are," George said with a gentle smile, settling down on the ground beside Miguel, despite his expensive clothes and iconic status. "I heard what happened back there with that audition. I heard your song too before that fool cut you off." Miguel felt fresh tears threatening to spill as he relived the humiliation of his encounter with Robert Caldwell. "I guess he was right," Miguel said quietly. "Maybe I don't belong in country music. Maybe I was fooling myself thinking someone like me could make it in this industry." George was quiet for a long moment, studying the young man's face and recognizing the kind of pain that goes deeper than just a failed audition. This was the pain of having your identity and worth questioned, of being told you don't belong in the very culture that shaped your heart and soul. "Miguel," George said finally, "let me tell you something about country music that maybe nobody ever taught you. This music wasn't born in boardrooms or record label offices. It came from working people, from folks who understood struggle and heartbreak and hope. It came from immigrants and farm workers and ranch hands and people who knew what it meant to work hard for everything they had." Miguel listened intently as George continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience in the music industry. Some of the greatest country songs ever written were about people just like you and your family. People who came to this country looking for a better life. People who worked with their hands. People who understood that the American dream isn't something you're handed. It's something you earn through sweat and determination and refusing to give up when people tell you that you don't belong. The sincerity in George's voice was unmistakable, and Miguel felt something beginning to heal inside his chest, a small flame of hope flickering back to life despite the crushing disappointment of the day. "That song you were singing," George continued, "those lyrics about carrying your grandfather's stories while reaching for your dreams, that's as country as anything I've ever heard. That's what real country music is supposed to be about. Not some narrow definition created by people who've forgotten where this music came from." George paused, seeming to wrestle with a decision before continuing. "Miguel, I want to tell you something that most people don't know about me, something I've kept private for most of my career, but maybe it's time to share it with someone who needs to hear it." Miguel turned to face George fully, sensing that he was about to hear something significant, something that would help him understand not just George Strait the performer, but George Strait the man. "When I was starting out in this business, I wasn't the clean-cut all-American country star that people see today," George began. "I grew up poor in a small town, and my family had its share of struggles that we didn't talk about publicly. My father worked ranch jobs when he could find them, and my mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. We weren't the kind of people who were supposed to make it in the music business." George's voice carried a vulnerability that Miguel had never heard in any of his interviews or public appearances. This was a side of the superstar that the public never saw, the human being behind the legend. "When I first tried to get a record deal, I was turned down by every major label in Nashville. They told me my style was too traditional, that I didn't fit the image they wanted for country music in the modern era. One executive actually told me I should consider finding a different line of work because I didn't have what it takes to be a star." Miguel found it almost impossible to believe that George Strait, the man who had sold more albums than almost any country artist in history, had once faced the same kind of rejection and doubt that Miguel was experiencing. "But I had something that kept me going," George continued. "I had people who believed in me, and more importantly, I had stories that needed to be told. Songs about real people living real lives, working hard and loving deeply, and struggling with the same challenges that most Americans face every day. That's what country music is supposed to be about, Miguel. Not some exclusive club for people who fit a certain image or come from certain backgrounds." George stood up and extended his hand to help Miguel to his feet. "I've been in this business for over 4 decades, and I've seen a lot of talented people get discouraged and give up because someone told them they didn't belong. But I've also seen what happens when truly gifted artists refuse to accept that kind of narrow thinking." As Miguel stood, George placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Son, what happened to you today was wrong. It was ignorant and hurtful, and completely contrary to what country music should represent. But I don't want you to let one man's prejudice destroy a dream that you've worked so hard to pursue." "But Mr. Strait," Miguel said, his voice still shaky with emotion, "how do I know if I'm really good enough? How do I know if this isn't just a waste of time?" George smiled, and for the first time that day, Miguel saw genuine warmth and encouragement in someone's eyes. "Miguel, I've been listening to singers for my entire career. I've heard thousands of auditions, worked with the best vocalists in the business, and I can tell you without any doubt that you have something special. Your voice has that quality that can't be taught or manufactured. It comes from the heart, from real experience, from understanding what music means to people." George paused, seeming to make another significant decision. "In fact, I'm so sure about your talent that I want to make you an offer. But first I need to tell you about something I've been doing quietly for the past 15 years, something that very few people in the industry know about." Miguel waited, his heart racing as he sensed that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. "I've been running a program," George continued, "working with young musicians who have real talent but maybe don't have the connections or resources to break into the industry. I've been helping them develop their skills, make the right connections, and find opportunities to showcase their abilities. It's something I do privately away from the media and the spotlight because I believe in giving back to the music that's given me so much." The revelation hit Miguel like a thunderbolt. George Strait, his musical hero, was offering him exactly the kind of opportunity he had dreamed about but never dared to hope for. "The thing is," George said with a slight grin, This program is about to go public in a big way. I've been planning to announce a major expansion, turning it into a foundation that will help hundreds of young musicians across the country. And after what I witnessed today, I think it's time to make that announcement in a way that sends a clear message about what country music really stands for. George looked directly into Miguel's eyes, his expression serious and determined. Miguel, I want you to be the first official recipient of this expanded program. But more than that, I want you to help me make a statement about inclusion and respect and the true values of country music. Are you willing to trust me and see where this journey takes us? Miguel felt as if he were in a dream, unable to fully process the magnitude of what was being offered to him. Just hours ago, he had been devastated by rejection and humiliation. Now, the biggest star in country music was offering him a chance to not only pursue his dreams, but to help change the industry itself. Mr. Strait, Miguel said, his voice barely above a whisper, I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever dreamed possible. Then say yes, George replied with a smile. Say yes and let's go show the world what real country music sounds like. But first, we need to go back to that audition stage. There's something I need to take care of with Mr. Caldwell, and I think you deserve to see how this story really ends. As they walked back toward the main festival area, Miguel felt a transformation taking place within himself. The shame and doubt that had consumed him just minutes earlier were being replaced by a sense of purpose and possibility that seemed almost overwhelming. He was about to witness George Strait confront the man who had tried to crush his dreams, and somehow Miguel sensed that this confrontation would be about much more than just one young man's audition. It would be about the soul of country music itself. The audition area was still buzzing with activity when George and Miguel arrived back at the judges' table. Robert Caldwell was holding court, regaling the other judges and several festival staff members with what he apparently considered an amusing story about his encounter with Miguel. His laughter carried across the area, each chuckle feeling like another slap in the face to Miguel, who stood slightly behind George, still struggling to believe what was happening. So I told the kid to go back to cleaning stables where he belongs, Caldwell was saying with obvious enjoyment. These people need to understand their place in the world. Country music isn't for everyone, you know what I mean? George's jaw tightened as he heard these words, but his expression remained calm and controlled. He had learned long ago that the most effective responses to ignorance and cruelty came not from explosive anger, but from quiet dignity and unwavering principle. He approached the judges' table with the confidence of a man who had earned every bit of respect the industry could offer. "Excuse me, gentlemen," George said, in a voice that was polite but carried unmistakable authority. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." The effect of George's presence was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, staff members turned to stare, and Robert Caldwell's smug expression faltered as he realized who was standing before him. The other judges rose respectfully from their chairs, clearly aware that they were in the presence of country music royalty. "Mr. Strait," stammered the female judge, "we had no idea you were here. Are you part of today's judging panel?" "I am," George replied simply. "I've been observing the auditions as a guest judge for the final round, and I have to say I'm quite concerned about what I've witnessed here today." Caldwell attempted to regain his composure, puffing out his chest and adopting what he apparently thought was an authoritative posture. "Well, Mr. Strait, it's certainly an honor to meet you. I'm Robert Caldwell, and I've been working in artist development for over 20 years. I think you'll find that I have high standards for the kind of talent we promote in this industry." "High standards," George repeated slowly, his tone suggesting that he was carefully considering these words. "That's interesting, Mr. Caldwell, because what I observed a little while ago didn't strike me as high standards. It struck me as something else entirely." The tension in the air was palpable. As festival staff and contestants began to gather around the judges' table, sensing that something significant was unfolding, Miguel stood slightly behind George, his heart pounding as he watched his hero confront the man who had humiliated him. "I'm not sure I follow," Caldwell said, though his nervous tone suggested he knew exactly what George was referring to. George stepped closer to the table, his presence commanding the attention of everyone within earshot. "Let me refresh your memory. About an hour ago, a young man named Miguel Sanchez auditioned for you. He performed an original song that demonstrated real talent, genuine emotion, and authentic storytelling. Instead of evaluating his musical abilities, you chose to attack his ethnic background and suggest that he didn't belong in country music. Caldwell's face reddened. Whether from embarrassment or anger, Miguel couldn't tell. "Now wait just a minute," Caldwell protested. "I was simply maintaining the integrity of country music traditions. This is about preserving the authentic American sound that has made this genre great." "Authentic American sound," George repeated, his voice growing stronger and more passionate. "Mr. Caldwell, let me educate you about authentic American sounds. Country music was born from the fusion of multiple cultures: Celtic folk traditions brought by Scottish and Irish immigrants, African rhythms introduced by enslaved people, Spanish influences from Mexican vaqueros, and Native American musical elements that existed on this continent long before any of us arrived." The crowd around the judges' table had grown substantially, with contestants, staff members, and festival attendees all drawn to this unexpected confrontation. Several people were recording the exchange on their phones, instinctively recognizing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. "The cowboy culture that inspired so much of our music," George continued, "was largely created by Mexican vaqueros who taught Anglo settlers how to work cattle and live on the range. Some of the most iconic country songs ever written were about immigration, hard work, and the struggle to build a better life in America. To suggest that someone like Miguel doesn't belong in country music is to fundamentally misunderstand what this music has always been about." Caldwell attempted to interrupt, but George held up a hand that silenced him immediately. "I'm not finished, sir. In my 4 decades in this business, I've had the privilege of working with artists from every conceivable background. Some of the most talented musicians I've ever known were people who looked different from me, spoke different languages at home, or came from different cultures. What they all shared was a love of music and stories that needed to be told." George turned slightly, gesturing for Miguel to join him at the front of the group. Miguel hesitated for a moment, still overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the situation, but George's encouraging nod gave him the courage to step forward. "Miguel," George said, his voice now carrying the warmth and respect that had been so notably absent from Caldwell's treatment of the young man, "would you be willing to finish the song that Mr. Caldwell interrupted earlier? I think these people deserve to hear what real country music sounds like." Miguel's hands trembled as he removed his guitar from its case, but as he looked out at the crowd of faces watching him with curiosity and anticipation, he felt a surge of confidence he had never experienced before. This wasn't just about his own dreams anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their abilities. "This is a song I wrote about my family's journey," Miguel said, his voice clear and strong. "It's about honoring where you come from while working toward where you want to go." As Miguel began to play the opening chords of Roots and Wings, the crowd fell completely silent. His guitar work was intricate but never flashy, supporting the melody in a way that drew attention to the emotional content of the song rather than technical showmanship. When he began to sing, his voice carried all the pain and hope of his experiences, creating an immediate connection with everyone listening. "I carry the stories my grandfather told, of mountains and valleys and hearts brave and bold. I honor the struggle that brought us this far, while reaching for dreams like a bright northern star. These roots run deep in the Texas soil, watered by generations of love and toil. But roots give strength to spread your wings and fly toward the hope that tomorrow brings." The second verse painted vivid pictures of immigrant families working in fields, children translating for parents at school meetings, and young people balancing respect for tradition with ambition for the future. Every word resonated with authenticity and genuine emotion, creating the kind of connection that separates true artistry from mere technical proficiency. As Miguel sang the bridge of his song, something unexpected happened. George Strait, standing just a few feet away, began to harmonize with him, his legendary voice blending seamlessly with Miguel's in a spontaneous musical collaboration that left the entire crowd speechless. The harmony was perfect, not just technically but emotionally, two voices from different generations and backgrounds finding common ground in the universal language of music. When the song ended, the silence lasted for several seconds before erupting into thunderous applause that seemed to go on forever. People were crying, cheering, and calling out encouragement to Miguel, their response making it clear that they had witnessed something truly special. George placed his hand on Miguel's shoulder, and turned to address Robert Caldwell directly. "Mr. Caldwell, that young man just delivered one of the most authentic country music performances I've heard in years. His song tells a genuine American story with skill, passion, and honesty. If you can't recognize that kind of talent, then you have no business judging auditions or influencing the direction of this industry." Caldwell's face was now completely red, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious humiliation, as he found himself on the wrong side of a very public confrontation with one of the most respected figures in country music. "Mr. Strait, I think you're overreacting to a simple difference of opinion about artistic direction." "This isn't about artistic direction," George replied firmly. "This is about basic human decency and respect. It's about understanding that music belongs to everyone who has a story to tell and the talent to tell it well. And it's about making sure that young artists like Miguel are judged by their abilities, not by prejudices that have no place in this industry." George turned to address the festival organizers, who had been watching the entire exchange with obvious discomfort. "I think it's time for some changes around here. Country music is supposed to bring people together, not drive them apart. We need judges who understand that. And we need an environment where every talented artist gets a fair chance to be heard." The festival director stepped forward, clearly realizing that he was facing a situation that required immediate action. "Mr. Strait, we certainly didn't intend for anything like this to happen. We'll be reviewing our judging procedures and making sure that all contestants are treated with appropriate respect." "That's a good start," George replied, "but I think we can do better than that. Miguel, how would you feel about performing this song on the main stage tonight? I think this festival audience deserves to hear what they almost missed." The invitation to perform on the main stage was beyond anything Miguel had ever dared to imagine, but as he looked out at the crowd of people who had just embraced his music so enthusiastically, he knew that this was exactly where he belonged. His journey from the ranch in Cedar Creek to this moment had been filled with challenges and setbacks, but it had led him to this opportunity to share his story with the world. The main stage at the Lone Star Country Music Festival was a sight to behold as the sun began to set over the Texas horizon. Thousands of people filled the area in front of the massive platform, their faces illuminated by the colorful stage lights that created an almost magical atmosphere. Miguel stood in the wings beside George Strait, still struggling to believe that he was about to perform before the largest audience of his life alongside his musical hero. "You ready for this, son?" George asked, checking his own guitar one final time before their scheduled performance. Miguel nodded, though his hands were shaking slightly as he held his grandfather's well-worn instrument. "I think so, Mr. Strait. I just keep thinking about all the people who believed in me to get to this moment. My parents, Martha Henderson, and now you. I don't want to let anyone down." "Miguel," George said, placing a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder, "you've already proven everything you need to prove today. Just get up there and tell your story the way you've been telling it all along. The rest will take care of itself." The festival announcer's voice boomed across the crowd, introducing the surprise guest performance that would close out the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the king of country music himself, George Strait, joined by a very special guest, Miguel Sanchez." The roar from the crowd was deafening as George and Miguel walked onto the stage together. Miguel had performed for small audiences before, but nothing had prepared him for the energy and excitement of thousands of people cheering and applauding. He could see families in the crowd, young children sitting on their parents' shoulders, couples holding hands, and groups of friends who had come together to enjoy an evening of music. "Good evening, Texas," George called out, his voice carrying easily across the festival grounds through the powerful sound system. "I want to tell you all about something that happened here today that reminded me why I fell in love with country music in the first place." George went on to briefly explain the events of the afternoon, describing Miguel's audition and the unfair treatment he had received from Robert Caldwell. The crowd's reaction was immediate and passionate, with boos and angry shouts directed toward the mention of prejudice and discrimination, followed by enthusiastic cheers when George described his decision to intervene. "Country music has always been about telling the stories of real people living real lives," George continued. "It's about celebrating the values that make America great: hard work, determination, respect for family, and the belief that anyone can achieve their dreams if they're willing to work for them. Those values don't belong to any one group of people, and neither does country music." Miguel felt his nervousness beginning to fade as George spoke, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that seemed to flow from the energy of the crowd and the sincerity of George's words. This wasn't just about his own performance anymore. It was about representing something larger, something important. "Now I want you to hear from a young man who embodies everything that country music should be about," George said, turning toward Miguel with an encouraging smile. "This is Miguel Sanchez, and he's got a story to tell." Miguel stepped forward to the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces watching him with curiosity and anticipation. He thought about his parents back home in Cedar Creek, probably watching the festival live stream on their old television, and about Martha Henderson, who had believed in him enough to help him get to this audition in the first place. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Miguel began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "A few hours ago, I thought my dream of being a country music singer was over. Someone told me that people like me don't belong in this industry, that we should stick to other kinds of music and leave country to real Americans." The crowd responded with more boos and shouts of disagreement, their support giving Miguel the confidence to continue. "But I want you to know that my family has been in Texas for 3 generations. My great-grandfather worked on ranches across this state. My grandfather served in World War II, and my father has spent his whole life working to provide for our family and contribute to our community. We are as American as anyone else, and country music is as much ours as it is anyone's." Miguel began to play the opening chords of Roots and Wings, but before he started singing, he looked directly into the crowd and spoke from his heart. "This song is for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong somewhere, everyone who has ever had to work twice as hard to prove their worth, and everyone who has ever held on to their dreams even when the world seemed to be against them." As Miguel sang his song on that massive stage, his voice carried across the festival grounds with power and emotion that seemed to touch every person in the audience. The lyrics that had been written in his small bedroom in Cedar Creek, inspired by his experiences working at the ranch and dreaming of a different future, now resonated with thousands of people who found their own stories reflected in his words. When Miguel reached the chorus, something magical happened. George Strait joined in with the harmony they had created earlier, but this time they were joined by voices from the crowd. People throughout the audience began singing along, even though they had never heard the song before, somehow intuiting the melody and embracing the message of hope and determination that it conveyed. The performance built to a crescendo that left the entire festival grounds echoing with music and applause. Miguel felt tears streaming down his face as he realized that his dream hadn't just come true, it had exceeded anything he could have imagined. This wasn't just about his own success. It was about proving that music could bring people together across all the barriers that society tried to put between them. As the song ended and the applause gradually died down, George stepped back to the microphone with an announcement that would change Miguel's life forever. "Friends, I want you to know that what you've witnessed tonight is just the beginning," George said. "Miguel Sanchez is going to be the first artist signed to a new program I'm announcing called George Strait New Voices. This initiative will seek out and support talented musicians from all backgrounds who have stories to tell and the ability to tell them through music." The crowd erupted in cheers as George continued his announcement. "We're going to make sure that country music remains a place where anyone with talent and determination can pursue their dreams, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. And we're going to start by giving Miguel the support he needs to record his first album and share his music with the world." Miguel felt overwhelmed by the generosity and support he was receiving, but George wasn't finished with his surprises. "There's one more thing," George said with a grin. "That gentleman who judged Miguel so unfairly today, well, he's no longer associated with this festival or any other events that I have influence over. This industry has no place for prejudice and discrimination, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that talented artists are judged by their abilities, not by ignorant assumptions about their backgrounds." The news that Robert Caldwell had been fired was met with enthusiastic approval from the crowd, but Miguel found himself thinking about something more important than revenge or vindication. He was thinking about all the other young musicians who might be watching this performance, all the kids who had been told they didn't belong somewhere, all the dreamers who needed to know that their stories mattered. 1 year later, Miguel Sanchez stood on another stage, this time at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, performing songs from his debut album Roots and Wings, which had climbed to #1 on the country charts and earned critical acclaim for its authentic storytelling and emotional depth. The album had been produced by George Strait himself, and every song on it told stories of immigrant families, working-class struggles, and the kind of hope that refuses to be extinguished. The George Strait New Voices program had expanded beyond anyone's expectations, providing scholarships, mentorship, and performance opportunities to dozens of young musicians from diverse backgrounds across the country. The program had changed the landscape of country music, opening doors for artists who might never have had a chance to be heard. As Miguel finished his performance at the Opry that night, he looked out at an audience that included his parents, Martha Henderson, and George Strait himself, all of whom had traveled to Nashville to witness this milestone in his career. He thought about that day at the Lone Star Country Music Festival, when his dreams had seemed shattered beyond repair, and how one man's kindness and courage had changed everything. But perhaps most importantly, Miguel thought about the letter he had received just that morning from a 15-year-old girl in California named Sofia Rodriguez. She had written to tell him that his music had inspired her to keep pursuing her own dreams of becoming a singer, despite being told by a teacher that her accent would prevent her from succeeding in country music. Sofia had enclosed a recording of herself singing one of Miguel's songs, and her voice was absolutely beautiful. Miguel had already forwarded Sofia's information to the George Strait New Voices program coordinator, knowing that she would soon receive the same kind of support and encouragement that had changed his own life. This was how change really happened, he realized, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through one person helping another, one dream supporting another, one voice giving strength to the next. As the curtains closed on his Opry performance, Miguel Sanchez smiled and whispered a quiet thank you to his grandfather, whose old guitar had carried him from the stables of Riverside Ranch to the most prestigious stage in country music. The boy who had once been told he didn't belong had found his place, and in doing so had helped create space for countless others to find theirs as well. The story of Miguel Sanchez and George Strait became legend in country music circles, but more than that, it became a reminder that the best of America happens when people stand up for what's right, when talent is recognized regardless of its source, and when established voices use their power to lift up those who are still finding theirs. In the end, that's what country music had always been about, telling the stories that matter, celebrating the people who make America great, and proving that dreams don't have expiration dates for those brave enough to pursue them.